When I got into a documentary editing room for the first time, I found that really suited me better. As the editor, you need to know how to tell a story. You work with music, you work with ideas, you work mechanically. I think I've maybe worked on 40 different projects. I'm very happy to see the contemporary art scene growing in Uzbekistan, because this one seems I'm an editor.
Обычно в работе эти люди за кадром, но именно их роль в том или ином продукте, фильме, программе решающая. Именно они смотрят на готовую работу как бы с высоты птичьего полета и придают особое дыхание, вкладывая тот самый месседж, создавая невидимую нить между создателями и зрителем. В гостях проекта «Культ личности» сайта интервью Джулиана Пиррони. Мой первый вопрос: кто такая Джулиана Перрони?
All right. Well, it's a very philosophical question. In Uzbekistan, I'm primarily the wife of the Swiss ambassador. Professionally, I am a film editor, documentary film editor.
Почему вы выбрали именно этот путь – быть за кадром?
I'm from the United States, and as a young person, I went to university and I studied history. But my interest was always in film, and I didn't think it was a very practical interest, so I studied history. But while in university, I began audio recording and learning about cinema. And when I was finished, I moved to New York City, and I worked then as an audio recordist. And I moved into editing from that, first in feature films and then in documentary. And I worked then for 25 years as a practicing film editor. Before then, I started teaching following that. And I taught at university for 5 years. Many years after I graduated, I returned as a visiting artist, and I taught for 1 year at University of Wisconsin-Madison, and I taught for 4 years at a university in Washington, D.C. called Howard University.
Над какими проектами в документалистике вы работали?
I fell into documentary film. I started out wanting to be, like many young people, wanting to make fiction films. But as I mentioned earlier, I was a major in history at the university. And when I got into a documentary editing room for the first time, I found that really suited me better. The crew was smaller, there were fewer people in the editing room, and I could get more involved, which also interested me. My first documentary film was a history film about the beginning of the Second World War. And it was a very small team making the film, and so I took on many jobs. I was a researcher, I was an editing assistant, and an associate producer.
А сколько фильмов за вашими плечами уже на сегодняшний день?
I think I've maybe worked on 40 different projects. Most of the time I was an editor, although I also moved into video recording. I'm old enough that I started working on film, and the cameras at the time were very heavy and quite complicated. In my lifetime, we moved to digital editing, and also the cameras became much smaller. At the time in New York, there was a movement to combine the editor and the field producer into one job, and they called it a predator. An editor-producer. This meant that the editor would go into the field, be trained in shooting video, and shoot the video. And this is actually a very good idea, because if you have a gift for photography, as an editor, you know what you need to gather in order to cut a scene. And at the time, I was working in what was called reality television, which was a cinema verite style, where you hold the camera and you follow the action.
Кем вы больше себя ощущаете? Редактором, продюсером или фильммейкером?
I believe that the role of the editor is perhaps the most important and most interesting of all of the roles. As the editor, you need to know how to tell a story. You work with music, you work with ideas, you work mechanically, it exercises so many different parts of my personality or of anyone's personality. I think it's a very fulfilling job and a very critical job in making of a good film. If you don't have a good editor, you can't have a good film. There's a long tradition of women as editors in the film business in the United States and around the world. I think it's because editors were not visible. You would see the director who's out there and telling everyone what to do. You'd see the producer who's doing that. But women weren't able to do that. They weren't allowed to do that 50 years ago, 60 years ago. And so the idea, the place where women could really take power and really realize their career was in the editing room. If you look at old films, you see a lot of women in the credits as editors.
Над какими проектами за это время удалось поработать здесь?
There are two projects I've done since I've been in Uzbekistan that I found really remarkable experiences for me. The first one was a group of 10 students, and each student made a short film, and we went from the first stage of finding an idea through to the end of screening the film in front of an audience. And these were all documentary films. And my attempt with these students was to push them beyond their comfort level, to try to get them to see really the potential for documentary. Documentary is not only talking about arts and culture. Documentary can be informative, can be creating dialogue about important social subjects, can be telling people about something they need to know about and that they should be concerned about. The second project I did that I was very excited about is a longer documentary. I worked with a team of 3 students and we made a 20-minute documentary.
А как проходит ваш день?
Coronavirus has changed my life tremendously, both as a film professional and as the wife of a diplomat. We can no longer use the Swiss residence as an opportunity to connect with Uzbek officials and prominent Uzbek artists and people as we've done in the past. And for the other side of me, which is my private life and my personal professional life, it's meant that I can't be teaching. And so I spend a lot of time in my office researching things and doing small personal projects. People send me films. Friends or acquaintances from the United States, and they ask me to look at it, to help them with the structure or to help them give them a critique on their film. So I've been doing some of that, which has been great.
В эти дни у нас в городе проходит масштабная интерактивная выставка поп-арт «Изоляция». Что вы думаете о современном искусстве?
10 years ago, I edited a film on Andy Warhol, who was one of the big pop artists of the 1950s and 60s. And I think the historical function of pop art in society was commentary on consumerism and mass production, on advertising and messaging coming from the corporate world. So I think now taking that movement into our contemporary world, I think is a great idea. It's using the language of pop art in order to discuss what's happening now. And what's happening now, we're not really so much thinking about consumerism and mass production. We're thinking about COVID and isolation and what that has meant to us. And so looking at that through the discipline of pop art, I think is a great idea. Further, I think that building an audience for contemporary art is tremendously important in Uzbekistan for the growth of the arts in general.